Cool. Good to be back, Gregor. Continuing our conversation around the shadows of trauma-informed culture.
Yes, hello. Hi, David. Good to be back, and I'm curious what we're gonna cook up as part two of this conversation.
Yes, same here.
Or maybe we're gonna have to have a part three.
I assume so. At least it would be possible. Um, yeah, so one thing I wanted to pick up on to continue the conversation was you were talking about how like potential shadow sides of what we think is trauma informed, and kind of this like that discomfort becomes a thing that we should be trying to avoid, and safety becomes this huge thing, and there can be misunderstandings around that. And I think it's like, if for me, it feels important to acknowledge that there are still big parts of society and whatever different communities, even that I'm part of to some degree, where showing yourself in uh, your pain, your wounding, your vulnerabilities, uh, you would be kind of called out for that, and kind of you would be seen as like, oh, just buckle up and stop being such a sissy or whatever. That there's still lots of places where um, people are very much identified with the hero, like with the one that endures pain and that keeps on going anyway, and so on. And on the other side, there are, as like a more recent development, there are communities where it's almost like more appreciated if you and recognized as like a good thing if you do show yourself in your vulnerability, in your pain, in your wounding. And where one shadow side could be that you show yourself less in your power and in your strength, and in this side, because there's like the, I would say, mostly implicit idea that um, if you do that, you're maybe uh, continuing an abusive, negative societal idea or something like that. And like the real thing is to connect with this vulnerability, weakness um, side of you. Probably didn't use the best words for this part right now, but yeah, just acknowledging that there's both of these sides, and that it's not simply like, okay, we've gone too far, let's go back. And this, but these two sides talk about each other as like, yeah, the other side is wrong. Like this side, which I think I also said like would be more considered like the conservative side, politically speaking, would say like, yeah, we've gone way too far and this is wrong and bad. And then this side would say the same about the other side. So we're kind of stuck um, between two sides that are both are not integrated, I guess. Yeah, curious, what's your follow up on that or perspective?
Hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think you described it pretty well in the different expressions how this societal movements are happening. And so there's two things. I think it's totally spot on what you say, that if we look at the long arc of human history, that we've gone a lot from really celebrating and appreciating and applauding the heroes, that of course are also naturally more the aggressors and the perpetrators in any kind of story. So often the hero is the one that kills, slays,
Hmm.
and not just the rightfully the evil soul, but there's often a lot of brutality also attached to it.
Hmm.
And so we, or the one that, so it doesn't always have to be just in a warlike situation, but very often it was and still is. But also being in a way like overcoming one's own obstacles, slaying the inner dragon, and overcoming the the instinct to, or the need for softness, but like
Mm.
creating something else out of that, creating a different kind of strength that
Would
we
you,
gone. Yeah.
would you mean someone like, because I was like thinking of stories, and in stories I feel like the hero is often also the rescuer. Like he fights someone or something to rescue someone. But then maybe a good example of this would be someone like Christopher Columbus, who is being celebrated for a great accomplishment, and depending on who you talk to, is being seen as like
Hmm.
uh the great explorer and so on, or he's being seen as like having killed a lot of innocent people. Would that be a good example of what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, and there's like many mythological. I mean, just look at Greek myth, for
Mhm.
example, and so on. Yeah, but like definitely, and there's the whole variety of people like this, or even yeah, conquerors are a good example. I just recently heard in a podcast a very interesting observation that, um, for example, in the Iron Age, like thousands of years ago, maybe there was a example given in the Syrian um, state or kind of empire at that time. They were famous for being relatively brutal and sacking cities and uh, killing hundreds of thousands of people, probably. And they were not hiding what they did. They
Mhm.
actually wrote it down and made heroic songs about it, and scripture, which was like celebrating the great deed of this display of strength and power,
Mhm.
because that was the to
Mhm.
some degree the value system that was there, that was developing. Like, if I can have that power to overcome somebody who is weaker, then this is what life wants of me and of other people, and I'm celebrating that might. And we've gone a long way that we're in a way we're no the way we look at it has become different. We're still doing it. I mean, right now we look at the war scenarios that are going on right now so terribly in this planet. But we're not so much, since a couple of 100 years and maybe some degrees already before, not so much anymore glorifying and celebrating the brutality and the atrocities. We're kind of like downplaying and trying to minimize and hide it while still doing it, but calling it more like necessity. But it's not anymore something we want to be celebrated for. So there has been a shift in the consciousness and in values. Um, and now even more so, and that's actually relatively, as we talked last time, recent, that there is more of also a sympathy for the victim. Like even in old myth, often you don't have so much real strong sympathy, or a big story wasn't created around the person who was wounded. It was around the person that was wounded but overcame the wounding,
Mhm.
which, if we take it even more metaphorical, is is also the story of trauma healing. You explore you're being hurt by life. You create a wound and you find a way to outgrow that identification. And the and so we have much more sympathy for that this is also something where life needs something. And sometimes I think specifically trauma informed perspective, which is even more recent, is that it's not always just by sheer will that
Mhm.
you can overcome and heal. That it's I think it's a connection to something even more, in a way, um archaic maybe is not the right word, but um, the natural wisdom of life that maybe more indigenous cultures still kind of preserve, that the interdependence of life is needed for healing. There's an element of your will, and there's an element that you cannot just do by yourself. That's what we talk about in trauma all the time. There is something that you need that you might not be able to do by yourself.
Mhm.
That might come through the grace of God, but often comes through the grace of friends, therapists, healers, and also allowing yourself to be in a state of needing something independent.
Yeah.
That is more, I think, a fresher place, and that is now often very much highlighted, where we highlight the systemic aspect of things. Also, we had this political analogy, like
Mm.
conservatives are more still connected to, and not wrongly so, it's just one element of life, to the heroic dimension, the willful dimension of the individual being able to do something incredibly strong. And maybe the more progressive liberals are bringing in the systemic dimension of like, yeah, not everything is just your own doing or your own lack of doing.
Yeah.
There's also forces that are larger, where you need to be supported from the outside. And
Well,
then one thing before we go on from there, I want to say, because you mentioned, so then maybe not in all circles you're being like, certain circles where you're being called out for being too weak, and then there's circles where you're being maybe more highlighted or celebrated for showing your vulnerability and how this creates shadow effects. And it's always interesting to see what kind of culture we are creating. Is this like an explicit
mm,
clarity of like, this is good to also bring in, or
mm,
does it become like the implicit rule of how to be in, how to be cool, how to belong,
yeah.
and being afraid of like breaking those rules and those laws? Because true vulnerability or trauma informed inclusion doesn't care about cultural norms or rules. It's relating to when this is necessary for the next step to show
Yes.
my vulnerability, then this is the most important and intelligent move to make,
Yes.
which is different to, I think, one of the shadow effects we're talking about. Are we creating another form of identification or
Yeah.
of preferred identity? And I think we always have to be aware of like, which one are we talking about? Is this a
Mm,
conscious choice, or is it just a different way of now having flipped the coin of how to find appreciation, belonging, maybe even social credit, like getting social attention and stuff like this, which are all, of course, necessary things, but we
yeah.
have to be aware of on the growth path to not confuse the two.
Yeah, and to see the difference between uh creating spaces where we are invited to show up with more of who we are, or whether one thing is being exchanged for another. I think you said
Exactly.
before we started recording, and I really liked this, like, is there just a new idea of, okay, now I'm supposed to show up like this and not like this? Or do I actually feel like, oh, wow, there's more possibility for me to show up in various ways? And it almost like um, it like increases my inner degrees of freedom of how I can show up in such spaces.
Exactly.
And just one more thing I
Mhm.
wanted to bring in while you were speaking. Um, for me, interestingly, Jesus has been very present in the last few months, and actually partially because of a recommendation from your side, the TV series The Chosen, which I really, really like, and it was a cool way for me to get to know the Old Testament more deeply. Um, and I feel like Jesus, I don't know if it was the very beginning, but I mean, I think he informed us culturally a lot about that possibility to empathize or sympathize more with the victim. And I mean, it's what he did his whole life. And it's kind of interesting that the people nowadays who um, are more on this side of maybe over empathizing with this side and kind of disregarding something else, uh, are mostly not at all connected to the teachings of Jesus. And uh, yeah, I would say, I mean, the conservative side, I guess, is much more rooted consciously in those teachings, and like at least in our culture, like Christian, um, teachings, and they are looking at it more from this individualized perspective, and like still celebrating and appreciating more the hero. So that was an interesting observation um, while listening. And I think just to acknowledge that, yeah, this is a recent development what you're describing, but it's not like this is the first time this kind of way of looking at different groups of people. Yeah, that this is not the first time this has come up, that it's been present as like a way of perceiving different groups of people that's been present for at least 2000 years as a possibility, maybe not as like something that a larger group of people has integrated, but as a teaching at least.
Right. No, that's a very good point. It's interesting to um, think of Jesus in this in the context of this conversation.
Yeah.
And of course, this has always been present. Like every wisdom tradition, it wouldn't be wise if it would not
Mm.
include that also by nature, because then it would just be partial. So all traditions to some degree had that integrated. And of course, we get just more nuanced and more nuanced as our psyche is also getting more nuanced and more individual for that matter, which makes it also more complex.
Mm.
Um, but it's maybe has never gotten to the extent, or which is interesting as an experiment as a society, where this, at least in certain parts of the mainstream world, becomes almost like the the leading voice,
Mm.
where you can. And now I go to the more extreme element of the woke movement, like just to name one thing. And of course, it doesn't ever do fully justice to the whole movement because it's also more complex. But where the the name calling and the censoring and the public shaming of people who have potentially done something or might have done something, or who are being accused of having done something because somebody else feels something or has experienced something, and very often rightly so, but often also just going overboard. So where this becomes a leading voice, I think that's relatively new. And I don't have, and I'm happy to hear if people dig out some historical references of places where this has happened before. Be really curious to look into that or to see that. I just don't see one right now. And so I think also what you said is super interesting, where like, am I invited to show up as more?
Mm.
And I think growth, development, maturation always means there is more of myself, of my different selves being integrated and invited. And I think why the trauma informed movement, even if it's watered down and not fully understood, and it becomes like a cultural norm of like, oh, now it's a cool thing to bring in my vulnerability and my weakness, at first really feels like a healthy movement, and is because we're still, all of us, even if we're not fully conscious of this, even if you're a relatively young person on this planet and has been more your way of growing up already, but still our roots are so deeply drenched still in the more traditional ways where you had to hide your vulnerabilities, where you had to cover them up and just not talk about it. I mean, just watch old movies. How much of these characters are really showing what's going on in them, in themselves? So we still come from that kind of like soil. And
Mm.
then to suddenly have a space of permissions, like, oh, I can also
Mm.
actually share my worries, my doubts, my fears, my pains that I don't know where to place, and I can bring that into social context, is super powerful. And at first feels like an expansion because it's true. It's like something else that was hidden comes in. When that becomes then the new way of being, and then it turns maybe even around that there is something else then that I cannot bring in, actually, maybe partly my joy or also my perpetrator
Mm.
qualities that I have in myself, or the places where I have a strong opinion and that would trigger myself and others. If
Yeah.
that becomes then the taboo, we're not doing justice to the movement of expansion, and can more take place.
Yeah.
We're creating new barriers that first look like we're protecting something, and sometimes we have to have very firm boundaries to protect from something else. But if that becomes a cultural norm, we're suddenly shrinking again. And I think we can, I mean, I've been around for a while, being in my mid 40s, that sometimes it feels the mainstream world out there is not getting more wide and varied and open. It gets maybe more colorful, but it sometimes gets also very narrow, and certain
Mm.
things are people are hiding certain things of themselves more because of fear of being called out on certain things. So it's like interesting, in the process of trying to create more openness,
Yeah.
we might have, as is very often the case, have created something else as well. And I don't think that's intentional. Like some people then try to put a tag of intentionality of a weird, long lasting conspiracy of where we're being pulled back or into. I mean, I don't think that's the way life works. It comes from good intentions, and then always you create side effects, and that's fine. We just have to look like, interesting, in the next step forward. If we just keep doing more of the same, it will not create more openness, more possibility for inclusion. Also, there's a new call that we are needing to listen, I think, and it's, yeah, that's the conversation we're having.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the complexity of our time, that it's quite easy nowadays to find arguments that we're still living in a world that, where our vulnerability is not welcome and so on and so forth. But where I think it's also fairly easy for people to find arguments for, well, actually, my power is not welcome anymore, and I have to hold that back. Like, I think it speaks to the complexity that we're in, that both of these narratives are easily justifiable with evidence uh, that people experience in their day-to-day lives, which makes it, yeah, it makes things really tricky, because if there's like very clearly one main narrative, it makes sense to support something else. But when there's more of like a coexistence of two narratives that both have their shadow sides, it just makes things a bit more complex. Yeah, in terms of navigating them.
Yeah, which is, I think it's very true what you say, because I think it's pretty evident right now that we don't live in one world.
Yeah.
We live in multiple worlds. And it probably to some degree has always been the case. Now it's just that these worlds are communicating more with each other, and everybody can
Mm.
to some degree tap into those worlds by media and internet and communications that we have available.
Mm.
um, and it's true, it's super complicated, and I think you can always just, I mean, I cannot speak for somebody living in a war zone. Like that conversation would make no sense to them at all.
Yeah.
It's like it's completely, most probably completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
So I don't think that this brings value to that place or a particular experience of life. But then, so then I could say, or we could say, like, yeah, then let's drop it. I mean, what's the point? But in the world that we are living right now, and that we are engaged in, that we're plugged in, that we maybe have some impact, it is, at least in our estimation, it is relevant. So we keep on talking and sharing. And I think that's the best we can do, while hopefully maintaining an awareness that there are people living in wildly different worlds, and to kind of like let go of the mantle of absolutism and
Yes.
what we're sharing, that we say so much we don't know.
Yes.
and we don't, like, it's always an unfolding experiment of
Yes.
life. If you go to cultural developments, like, nobody got it figured out, nobody knows. It's like suddenly we're in a, wow, we're seeing side effects that we didn't imagine. Yeah, but now that's um and it's true, it makes it complex for sure, and sometimes really overwhelming, which is, I think,
Yes.
what a lot of people also experience.
Yep.
And then if we take that as something to, if we really respect that, then it's even a closer step and a closer call, which has to do with trauma work again. Like, so where do I land in myself, and how do I take care of myself, and how do I, again, it's a specific vulnerability of a kind to feel overwhelmed by this.
Yeah.
And how do I relate to that? Do I shut it out? And do I shame it? Do I get drowned by it? Do I find a
Do I
more
shame the thing
appropriate,
that makes me feel overwhelmed? Like the world should be simpler and it's becoming too
right?
complicated.
Right? Either I shame the outside for, like, and then the call for more simplicity and going back,
Yes.
of course, is very understandable,
Yeah.
political. The wish for a strong man or a woman or person to sort it out. And we have lots of historical references for moments like this.
Mm.
And it's a tricky one, because often what seems like a solution becomes the next round of um, yeah, creating a lot of new symptoms or maybe potentially hurt. So it's very understandable. And then,
Mm.
so either I shame the outside and I want change there, or I shame myself for, like, not being able to relate to this, and or I'll find appropriate ways how to build a loving, caring, wise relationship to those parts in myself again. And that's, again, it's inner work. There is no philosophical argument, there is no political movement, there is nothing
Mm.
that will take care of that to the full degree. It's part of the inner work. And narratives or ways of making sense of what I'm experiencing and what the world is going through is very powerful, or stories. And that's another vulnerability I think we have culturally. We have very little working stories,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
almost no stories anymore that for large parts of the human society works. So
Mm. Like the sense that I'm getting from this conversation is the world has become mm, like the external world has become more complex than our ability to hold that complexity. And so there's a lot of uh that brings up a lot of things of like reactions of how to cope with that kind of inability to hold this complexity. I'm also reminded of one thing one of my business mentors said, that the the most intelligent statement to a question that he would get, for example, from his clients is "it depends." That like most of the time you cannot answer a general question applied to a unique person without knowing their situation and their background. You would have to say it depends, and you would have to get to know the situation and then be able to make an informed answer, which makes it really complex because we want to have those simple answers that we can just use whenever. And I get curious where the understanding of trauma is maybe one of the missing links for us to be able to hold more complexity, or to like get this nervous system upgrade that we're able to meet the complexity of the world um, in an integrated way, like to be able to actually stay present with it, with opposing perspectives and polarities and so on.
yeah, and I want to maybe tie it back to the beginning of the conversation just for a moment, because so when or you mentioned Christopher Columbus.
Mhm.
So it's very easy, like history books were always pretty clear and straightforward, and like the great guy, the hero, the conqueror, the guy who explored and discovered a new continent and so on, brave guy, set sails against all odds and so on. So it sounds like a simple story. And of course, then we add the new story of like, whoa, what did that bring upon millions and millions of people, and what one person kind of like unleashed? Of course, even that's not just one person, and him personally, how he behaved like horrendously with disregard and power hungry opportunities, just like killing people, enslaving them, and so on, like a total disregard of human life. And so we can exchange one story with another story, or we say like, whoa, well, that's a very complicated person and a very complex life.
Yeah.
And this goes for everybody,
Yeah.
including the person who's speaking and the person who's listening. We're all complex. There's nobody that's just good, that's just bad. And we so much would love to have those
Yeah.
categories working again. Like we had so much of our lives when I grew up. There was still the East and the West, and it was very clear who were the
Yeah.
good guys and who were the bad guys. It was just, and it was, we felt sorry for the guys in the East, and but we didn't really care. Really, I mean, I remember starting as a kid, starting to read more authentic um, stories a bit about these, and I was like fascinated. Like, yeah, but they had full lives, and as a kid, that wasn't just
Yeah.
obvious because it wasn't the way it was talked about.
Mhm.
So I'm saying this in a way, like again, like with a new perspective coming in, like that we want to take care of the needs of marginalized, the pain that's been inflicted on people that really lived on the fringes of society, that were shamed, and all of this. This is really, really important.
Mm.
Where we then get a little um, off balance is then again then addressing people just as that, like creating an identity that's just based on that again. And then suddenly you have again a simple story with just the table turned of who is good and now who is bad, and who
Mm.
should get our sympathy and then who definitely shouldn't get our sympathy. So we're
Yeah.
still operating in this duality of victim perpetrator, and it doesn't do justice to life, and it doesn't do justice to ourselves and to human beings.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
not necessarily because we create more empathy and awareness, or we widen our awareness and of like our circles of empathy and our awareness of people suffering, doesn't mean automatically, like you said, that our capacity to really hold multiple perspectives have grown parallel with that, because that's real consciousness, heart, and hard work.
Yes.
Like when you mention Jesus, a guy that can hold almost all perspectives simultaneously, his own suffering and the suffering of the person stabbing his heart, the suffering of the people that Pontius Pilate that says, I wash my hand in innocence and I have nothing to do, and the suffering of the mob that says, put him on the cross, and not going into victimization or blame or anything of that, but like holding that in the heart, saying, okay, Lord,
Mm.
Father, if this is thy will,
Mm.
and saying yes to all of that. So that's what I mean, what kind of a
Mm.
tremendous, real heroic journey that is. Like hero in the sense of a true exploration of the deep dimensions of life and oneself. And so when we just now create more sympathy for people that are more, has been excluded or hasn't been granted sympathy before, this is great, and I think it helps us to grow, but we need to really watch that we're not getting complacent there and just exchange sympathy from one to the other. It's like you put your furniture, it's like one thing is to put your furniture from this room to the other room and just rearranging a little bit everything, or really reconstructing the house that you're living. And I think that's not always happening. And then one can get easily stuck there, complacently thinking of like, now we're on the good side. And it's not even like that you're hurting other people. Yes, you do, but it's like you're hurting yourself for not heeding the call of life, to grow, basically. So we need to be always watchful with the perspectives that we take, and we'll always make mistakes with that. But when we get too self-congratulatory about,
now I got it.
Now I got it. And then the phrase of like, yeah, it depends is a great one. When you look at the situation, it was very clear, like in a media story about, I mean, I have no idea what happened there, but like a few years back, this Johnny Depp incident was such a big one. It's like you had two factions in the world rooting for one or the other. I personally have no idea what, I didn't really go into it, but I could just observe like most likely it's more complex than that.
Yeah.
Because it's always.
And we cannot hide behind saying it's complex. I think that's maybe another layer of complexity, is just because the truth isn't simple doesn't mean that we are never supposed to take a side. I think there can be like a way of taking a side, taking into account that it's not just black and white, but that given the context, it still makes sense. I think that was powerful for me in the last years to see. But that can be a shadow as well, to be like, well, I see all sides. So
that means if this comes from the incapacity of taking a side, or the fear of like pissing somebody off or whatever, and I know that myself as well, one has to watch out, because then taking all sides means like taking no side. I'm not taking any perspective, or I'm not with anybody, not even with myself.
Yeah.
And because when I have a real perspective, that's the tricky bit, that we also seem to, I almost sounded like a cultural conservative, so like we lost that now, and then we had that, but now we lost it. Maybe we had it, I don't know. Is that when you take a stand for something, it doesn't mean that you need to get hard about it.
Yes.
Or that no other perspective can or is allowed to coexist next to yours anymore. And if somebody has another perspective, that you're become enemies, because it's by nature that's not the case at all. Most of the time, your wife, your spouse, your kid, your partner have different perspectives on things.
Yeah.
And you keep working with that together.
Yeah.
And the real art is to have that, to have really your perspective, to take your stand for things, and to be open to the other person, to yourself, to learn, to grow, to be influenced, to not be over influenced, so that you water down your perspective if that's not appropriate yet, but to be like, to have a permeable boundary, one that can breathe, like your skin.
Yeah.
That we don't shred our skin because it separates from other people, but we also don't cement our skin, because then we don't breathe anymore, like literally. Like physiologically we die. So our skin is a good example. It's a boundary. It's clear when it's, and maybe just the last thought on that is like, because the original word of the meaning of the word trauma is wound. It comes from the Greek word is wound. And it's like this, like you have a wound on your skin, and the
Mm.
life says this is not right, something needs to happen. And if it's a wound that cannot heal or is being too big, or keeps on being kind of like hurt, or whatever, something is going on that it cannot heal in a normal fashion, it festers, and it infects other parts of the body, or a very harsh or hard skin maybe grows over, but it's not really healed underneath.
Mm.
So there is something that where we say, like, this is not right, and it needs to be tended to.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we get too hard, when the skin gets too hard, nothing can penetrate there anymore,
Yeah.
because we need to protect, or it gets like so vulnerable that anything that touches it, or another perspective, is like, feels like it goes right to my inside.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's just all places where I know there's something to learn here, and maybe to heal over time.
Yeah. Nice. I recently heard the term on this topic of perspectives: strong beliefs held loosely. So
Mm-hmm.
and it's something I've been playing with as well. It's like to play with having perspectives, or taking the perspective of something that maybe in my group of people is less perceived as, and almost like challenging the perspective by going into a discussion with that, and not taking it personally if I'm wrong, but actually, yeah, like challenging both my perspective and the perspective of someone else. It's
Yeah, because the perspective is not a person.
yes, and I
So
think that's been
we
conflated quite a lot in
totally,
uh, our times. Is that
yeah,
yeah,
and
it's very easy.
we have to also watch again ourselves in that as well. It's very easy. Like, if I have a certain conviction,
Yeah,
and if that it becomes me,
yeah,
but it's not anymore me having a conviction. It's a conviction having me.
yes, yeah,
And and of course that happens in small things and in big things, but um, I always need to see, when I have an argument with somebody and the person disagrees, is that an attack on me personally, or is that just a difference? And sometimes the difference is so big that maybe I don't want to that I don't want to continue the conversation. Then that's fine,
yeah,
but not to make the other then a personal threat to me. The other's existence is not a personal threat to me, because we take it way too personal,
yeah.
and yeah. But that again takes work, or it takes work to notice where we're doing it,
Hmm.
because it happens rather frequently.
Yeah,
And it's good that we find new ways of solving these situations. I mean, it's good that, because some parts of the world respond to that by, throwing bombs.
yep.
And it's good that we wrestle with this, of how to find other ways to deal with that uncomfortable feeling of somebody being different, because people are different. Like,
Yes.
they're truly different to you.
And to actually handle it internally, because I think what we've done culturally a lot is to just disconnect from that part that feels uncomfortable with that dissonance, and we become more sensitive, we notice that part more, so it's easier for it to
Yeah.
take over. So how can I acknowledge that and don't let it run the show?
Yeah.
So
So
it's
I'm
called to
I'm
wrap it
wondering,
up.
as we're coming to the end, I'm wondering if we have talked appropriately about enough about the shadow of trauma informed culture now. Um, but let's see.
Let's let the listeners decide.
And maybe another part will follow, or in another, well, we'll come back to similar topics anyway, even starting from different places.
Yeah, and maybe just those who've listened until now, just a thank you and an appreciation. And if there's some way you want to contribute to that conversation, either add your perspective or add a question, then please feel free to do so. can do it under the YouTube video or on the Facebook page. Yeah, those are probably the best places to add your thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, and also it's a good moment to thank you to all everybody who's been listening. Either if you're new to this or if you've been listening to some episodes, we've been doing this for a while now, with sometimes longer breaks in between. But yeah, thank you for being here, and allow yourself to be challenged, inspired, and yeah, would love to hear if there's anything that comes to your mind.
Yeah, and see you in the next episode.
All right, thank you, David.
Thank you.